The night I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I remember thinking how strange it was, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking above the stove. Everything exactly the same as it had been the morning before, and yet nothing, not a single thing in my life, was the same anymore. Let me back up. My name is George. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a small but decent construction supply company in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Nothing flashy. We supplied lumber, hardware, concrete mix to contractors across the county. I knew every supplier by name. I knew which crews paid on time and which ones needed a reminder call on the 15th. I built that business the same way I built everything else in my life, slowly, carefully, and with the assumption that the people around me were doing the same. My son Daniel came to work with me 11 years ago. He was 32 at the time, had tried a few other things that hadn't worked out, and I was glad to have him, genuinely glad. I told my wife, Margaret, that having Daniel in the business felt like the whole thing finally meant something, like it would outlast me. My best friend, Ronald, had been my business partner for the last 8 of those years. We'd known each other since we were both young fathers coaching Little League on Saturday mornings, yelling at kids who didn't want to run the bases. Ronald was the kind of man who showed up when your mother died and stayed until the dishes were done. I trusted him with my financial records, my vendors, my reputation. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you the rest. These were not strangers. These were the 2 men I would have called from a hospital bed. The first sign came on a Tuesday in October. I had left my reading glasses at the office and driven back after dinner to get them. The building was dark, except for the conference room at the end of the hall, where a thin line of light crept under the door. I didn't think much of it. Daniel sometimes worked late. Ronald sometimes stopped by. I almost didn't stop. I was tired. My hip had been bothering me for weeks, but something I still can't explain what made me slow down at that door instead of walking past it. I didn't open it. I just stood there, and I heard my son's voice say very clearly, "By the time the anniversary party happens, it'll already be done. He won't have anything left to contest." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time, long enough for the air conditioning to click off, long enough to hear Ronald laugh that familiar, easy laugh I had heard 1,000 times and say, "He still thinks you're on his side." I walked back to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then I drove home, and I didn't say a word to Margaret. I want to tell you what that feels like, hearing something like that. People always imagine they would react immediately, that they would burst through the door, confront the betrayal head-on, demand answers right then and there. But that's not what happens. What happens is a kind of stillness. Your brain goes very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm, and something shifts behind your eyes. I had spent 31 years learning to read contracts, to spot the line in a proposal that would cost me everything if I missed it. That same instinct kicked in, cold and quiet, and told me, not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Margaret and stared at the ceiling, and I thought, our 40th wedding anniversary party was 6 weeks away. Margaret had been planning it for months, a dinner at the Riverside Grill, about 60 guests, family and old friends. Daniel was supposed to be giving a toast. Ronald was supposed to be his best man at our vow renewal. 6 weeks. That was the deadline they had given themselves. The next morning, I did something I had never done in 31 years of business. I called my accountant, a quiet and precise woman named Helen, and I asked her to pull every record for the past 18 months without telling anyone she was doing it. Helen called me back in 2 days. She didn't say much. She just read me a list of numbers. And the numbers told a story I already knew the ending of. Vendor invoices had been double billed and the difference pocketed. A line of credit had been extended under my signature, a signature I had never given. 3 of my largest contracts had been quietly renegotiated with a shell company that had been registered 4 months earlier. The registered agent of that company was my son's girlfriend. I sat in Helen's office and I looked at the total, and I thought about Little League. I thought about the morning Daniel was born, how I had held him in that hospital, and felt like the ground under my feet had become something permanent. Then I asked Helen to make me 3 copies of everything, and to store one set off-site. I still didn't say anything to Daniel, or to Ronald. I went to work the next Monday and shook both their hands and asked how the weekend had been. Ronald told me his knee was feeling better. Daniel said he'd been looking at a new truck. I nodded at both of them and went into my office and closed the door. There is a particular kind of loneliness in pretending. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who think they know exactly where you are, while you are standing somewhere else. Entirely. My granddaughter, Claire, is 24. She's Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, which makes the whole thing more complicated than I have words for. Claire had been staying with us for a few months while she finished her graduate program at Penn State. She was the kind of young woman who noticed things, small things, the kind that most people don't register. She noticed when Margaret seemed tired. She noticed when the mail came late. She noticed, one evening in November, that I had barely touched my dinner. She waited until Margaret went upstairs. Then she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Grandpa, what's wrong?" I looked at her for a long moment. She had her grandmother's eyes and her father's jaw, and it struck me then, painfully, that the people who betray you are never entirely separate from the people you love. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way young people look at old people when they are being patient about a lie. Then she said, "I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Last week, when I stopped by the office to drop off Dad's lunch, I put my coffee cup down. She told me she had been in the break room when Daniel and Ronald came in, not realizing she was there. She hadn't heard everything, but she had heard enough to understand that whatever they were planning, it was supposed to be finished before the anniversary party. I didn't know what to do," she said. "I didn't know who to tell." "You told me," I said. "I'm telling you now." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "What do we do?" That was the moment, I think. Not the night in the parking lot, not Helen's office, not the list of numbers. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a man standing alone at the edge of something terrible and started feeling like a man with a plan. We talked for 3 hours that night. Claire was methodical in a way that reminded me of myself at a much younger age before decades of trusting people had softened certain instincts. She had already thought through things I hadn't considered. She pointed out that confronting them directly would give them time to move assets or destroy records. She suggested we needed documentation of intent, not just financial irregularity. She had, I learned that night, already recorded one conversation on her phone. I asked her when she had done that. The day after I heard them in the break room, she said, "I went back. I told Dad I wanted to surprise him for lunch again." I looked at my granddaughter across that kitchen table, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly, something steadier than hope. Over the next 4 weeks, I moved carefully. I consulted an attorney. Not anyone Daniel or Ronald knew, a woman named Patricia who specialized in business fraud, and who, when I laid out the documents Helen had assembled, let out a slow breath and said, "Mr. George, this is quite thorough." I transferred certain assets into structures that protected them before any claim could be made. I updated my estate documents. I had 3 separate conversations with my bank that Daniel knew nothing about. At work, I was exactly the same as I had always been. I asked about Ronald's knee. I told Daniel the new truck looked sharp. I attended 2 vendor lunches and shook hands and smiled. Margaret knew something was happening. She didn't know what. She is a woman who has spent 40 years being married to a man who carries things quietly, and she has learned to wait. One evening she touched my arm in the hallway and said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." I told her I would explain everything after the party. She nodded. She didn't push. That is a particular kind of love that I have not always deserved, but have always been grateful for. The anniversary party was on a Saturday evening, in the middle of December. The Riverside Grill had been decorated with white flowers and small candles on every table, and when Margaret and I walked in, 60 people stood up and clapped, and she pressed her fingers against her mouth the way she does when something catches her off guard. I put my hand on her back and I looked around the room at our friends, our neighbors, our family. And I saw Daniel standing near the bar with a glass of wine, laughing at something Ronald had said. They both looked relaxed, comfortable. They looked like men who had already won. Dinner went the way these things go. Old friends told old stories. The food was good. Margaret's sister flew in from Denver and cried twice before the salad course was finished. Daniel gave his toast. He talked about watching me work when he was a boy about the values I had tried to pass on, about what an honor it was to carry the business forward. He looked straight at me when he said it. His voice didn't waver. I held Margaret's hand under the table. After the toasts, I stood up. I had told Patricia I was going to do this. She had advised against it. She said we had more than enough documentation to proceed through the courts without any confrontation. She said confrontation was unpredictable and emotionally costly and served no legal purpose. She was right on every count. I stood up anyway. I thanked everyone for coming. I thanked them for 40 years of friendship and witnessing and showing up. I talked about what it means to build something, a marriage, a business, a life, and what it costs, and what it requires from the people around you. Then I said that I had recently learned something important about legacy, about what we leave behind and who we trust to carry it. The room was quiet. Margaret looked up at me. Daniel's smile had become slightly fixed. I said that I had spent the past several weeks reviewing the records of my company, and that I had discovered some serious irregularities that my attorney and I had already addressed through the appropriate legal channels. I said that the relevant parties were aware that formal proceedings would begin the following Monday. I said I wanted everyone in that room to know this, not because I wanted to cause a scene, but because many of them had done business with me for decades and deserved to hear it from my mouth directly. I did not say Daniel's name. I did not say Ronald's name. I didn't need to. The room is not a large one. Ronald put his napkin on the table and stood up. He said my name once, in a tone that might have been protest or might have been apology. I genuinely could not tell. Then he walked out. Daniel sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then he looked at Claire, who was sitting 3 seats away from him, and something passed between them, recognition, I suppose, of how information travels in families. He looked at me. I looked back at him. He left without finishing his wine. Margaret waited until the room had recovered into its noise before she turned to me and said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" "About 6 weeks," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's why you couldn't sleep." "Yes." She refilled my water glass. She straightened the small card in front of her plate. Then she put her hand over mine on the table and she said, "Tell me everything. I have thought a great deal about what happened in the weeks and months after that evening." The legal process was long and unglamorous. Patricia was precise and relentless, and the outcome, while not everything I might have hoped for in some earlier version of my life, was enough. The shell company was dissolved. The fraudulent credit line was voided. There were financial penalties, and there are civil proceedings still working their way through the system. Daniel and I have not spoken since that night. I don't know if we will. I won't tell you that doesn't hurt, because it does. Some mornings I think about the boy who used to sit in my truck after Little League and eat a hot dog in silence, perfectly content just to be there, and I don't quite know how to reconcile that child with the man who sat across from me at a conference table and said he won't have anything left to contest. Ronald I think about less. Betrayal from a friend is different, sharper in some ways, cleaner in others. There's no grief for what the relationship was supposed to become. There's only the grief for what it was, which is considerable. But here's what I want you to understand, and I say this as a man who has had a long time now to sit with it. I was not ruined. They planned for my ruin, planned it carefully, planned it with spreadsheets and shell companies, and a timeline organized around what should have been one of the happiest evenings of my life. And yet I was not ruined, because 67 years teaches you something. If you've been paying attention, it teaches you that the people who underestimate you are almost always the people who think they know exactly what you're worth. They knew what the business was worth. They knew what the accounts were worth. They knew what the property was worth. They didn't know about Claire sitting in the break room with a phone in her pocket. They didn't know about 40 years of a woman who straightened a place card at the worst dinner of my life and said, "Tell me everything." They didn't know that I had spent 31 years reading the line in the contract that costs you everything if you miss it. I walked out of that restaurant on my wife's arm, and the night was cold and clear, and she leaned her head against my shoulder on the way to the car. And I thought not for the first time, and not for the last, that the thing worth protecting was never the business. It was always this. It was always her, and the granddaughter who came back the next day with a phone in her pocket because she loved me enough to do the uncomfortable thing. If you've been sitting with something similar, if you've been hearing things in hallways, noticing numbers that don't add up, feeling that stillness that comes before a storm. I want to say this directly to you. Don't act out of rage. Act out of clarity. Document everything. Find people you can trust, and make sure they're people no one else is expecting you to trust. Give yourself time to be certain. And when you're certain, don't waver. Dignity doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, quietly, in the choices you make when no one is watching. I wasn't the victim of my son and my best friend's plan. I was the reason it failed.